Hi. If you're a guest with us, welcome. We're a church that believes Jesus is who he said that he was, that he is who he says that he is, that his death and resurrection are integral to knowing God. And that gatherings like this, as well as all kinds of personal habits, can help us grow in that relationship. And yet integral to what we believe is that, like, central to what it means to be transformed and central to the way God transforms us more and more into, our full humanity, it involves serving. That it's not just a secondary thing, but that it's, the rabbi who said, I came to serve, not to be served. I came to pour out my life as a ransom for many, that's central to the way he forms and shapes us into his image. And so we're constantly gathering, hopefully in ways that are fun and relevant and offer levity and somewhat comical, worshipful, relational. And yet we're constantly reminding ourselves that this is only as good as it prepares us to spend the other 6 days telling God's story by the way we live and the way we serve. That belief, sure, that's integral, but being transformed into who he calls us to be is really what it's all about. And to that end, I just want to say good job to you with regards to this last week. I found myself a couple weeks ago sitting in my office kind of sulking and praying, like, man, Lord, it's been a while since we've had one of those organic opportunities to matter pop up. And then it was like, careful what you pray for kind of deals, because this last week was crazy and busy, and I know many of you were busy on the organic, everyday, life end. So those of you that helped, serve some friends on Tuesday night and scrub floors at Lewis and Clark, that was a blast. Good job. And then Wednesday night, a bunch of you helped man the climbing wall at Alive at 5, and then yesterday morning at 7 a.m. Unless you're Kyle Ball, then it was 7:10 a.m. I pulled up. Our friend Kyle is a single person who has a small business and works too many hours, and I pulled up to his house, and it was awfully dark in there. So I texted him, here. He texted me 2 minutes, and he came out with a jug of orange juice. I was like, dude, you can't just carry that around. You look like an acid head. You can't just carry a jug of orange juice around with you everywhere you go. Anyway, it was a friend. We helped a friend serve a friend of hers that she works with and move, and it was kind of a last-minute emergency thing, and so good job. I'm just proud to be a part of a church. Remember the first week we put a pool table on the stage and said, let's gather and scatter. It's fun to see you all doing that. Also, I want to touch on the baptism deal a little bit. So as I said, this September 11th, the first Sunday after Labor Day weekend, we have a habit of gathering, and Narrate provides the main course. It's kind of a meal deal. We provide the main course. Others provide what they want based upon where they're at in the alphabet. Though Joe would point out, you all just bring potato chips, which is kind of a sour thing for him. Anyway, I threw him under the bus last service too. Anyway, we gather, we eat, and then we're at Spring Meadow Lake, and then we dunk people. We baptize people. And I just want to offer a couple comments on baptism, because I recognize that it's a pretty bold, pretty uncomfortable statement, even for those of you who are pretty serious about following Jesus. I just want to challenge you to think about that. If in the last year, the last couple years, the last couple months, you kind of look back and go maybe you can pinpoint the date where you believed and you received his forgiveness. Maybe for you it's somewhere back there, I believed that, and you've not yet been baptized. I just encourage you to spend some time thinking and praying about that, and I'd love to buy you a cup of coffee if a conversation would help, and there's lots of friends I'm sure that you have around here that would do the same for you, so let us know how we can help you process that. A couple of things. In the early church, baptism was really integral. There weren't very many things that they would take a bullet for, so to speak, and it would appear that baptism was one of them, so much so that some theologians would go so far as to question whether or not it's even optional. Now, I wouldn't go there, but I think the fact that some people go that far says something about the importance that it held in the first century. And so I just encourage you to think and pray that through. And the other thing is, and this sounds blunt, and I don't mean it to be harsh, but it's also, I think, important to bear in mind that it's not about you. That, yeah, there's something personal about baptism. There's also something corporate about baptism, both in what it says to the people who are at the lake going, what are they doing? And it's purposeful that we do our baptisms in public for your friends, for your family, for the Narrate family. Because I think I speak for all of us who call this home when we say, well, if people aren't meeting Jesus and being transformed every year, then, let's go do something else with our time. Or at least let's go worship somewhere where that's actually happening. And so it's this one time a year where we get to celebrate, God is a transforming God. He is shaping people. He is changing people. And he's not just changing the way pre-existing Christians think and move and live and serve, but he's taking people who questioned God's existence and now have surrendered their life to him. So invite you, challenge you, encourage you to think about all of that. Love a conversation. Last week, we started the series called Why Ask? I just would like to touch real briefly kind of on where we were last week. If you weren't with us, like why ask is really about like, okay, so why pray? Like, what's the point of prayer? Like, how do I pray? It comes out of the tension, I suppose, for some of you who are grappling with God and his existence, and you hear these ideas of a God who is personal and sovereign and in control, and yet you look at the world around you and you question that at times. And maybe in your spiritual journey, you can kind of avoid that question, but the issue of prayer takes it to another level because it really presupposes that there's a God who can intervene. And maybe you have a hard time believing that, and so we said we're going to go there. We're going to have that conversation. Probably for others of you, and maybe more of you, the struggle is just to deal with the confusion and the disappointment and the like kind of mixed track record that is prayer. I mean, Jesus himself said, like, God already knows what you need before you ask, which raises the question, like, okay, so why ask? It's not a disrespectful question. It's an honest one. Like, okay, so why invest myself emotionally if God already knows what I need before I ask? We said that really last week was about like helping you, inviting you, encouraging you to begin to articulate where you're at, to begin to confess to God, like, God, here's what I think about prayer, here's what I believe about prayer, irrespective of whether or not it's orthodox, quote unquote. To begin to understand, like, what do you pray for and what don't you pray for, and why do you pray for those things, and what does that say about your understanding of prayer? To begin to kind of unearth the mystery and the frustration and the confusion so that we could move forward and go like, okay, so pray. Like, how do we do that? Why should we do that? You know, I was thinking this week as I was kind of processing this series, and like my prayer for this series is that by the middle of August, like the conduit through which we all communicate with God would just be that much more clear. You know, that we'd pour some Drano down that. Because at the end of the day, so to speak, I'm going to date myself with all kinds of colloquialisms I learned today. So we'll use a common overused one. At the end of the day, like everything we do, from getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning on Sunday to help set up, from being in the band and like playing music, to greeting, to helping a single mom move on a Saturday morning in July, to helping kids climb up a wall, to writing a check, to get behind God's kingdom work within a local church. Like everything we do, from helping a friend, help some friends, serve at a small business, to being intentional about our marriage and intentional about our parenting and serving our coworkers. At the end of the day, everything we do, reading our Bible and praying and fasting and all the spiritual disciplines, like everything that we do in the name of Jesus, it's really about one thing, right? Loving God, loving people. Sounds like two. Jesus said it's one. In fact, he called it the Jesus Creed. We talked this winter, remember we put a Christmas tree up here and we made it just look horrible because of all of the extra decorations, and just reminded ourselves that like following Jesus is so simple and profound, and yet we hang all this stuff on it. Well, my prayer for us in this series, honestly, is that like our communication with God would be that much better by the middle of August. That we would be more candid and more alive and more dynamic in the conversations that we have with him. Because really, right, it's about listening to him and talking to him. Speaking of listening, this elderly man went to the doctor, and as is the case when you go to the doctor, they get out the tongue depressor, right, and then they look in your eyeballs and they check your heart, and then he got to the part where he was looking in the man's ear. And as he was looking in there with his light, he saw what he thought was probably a foreign object. And so he looked a little closer, and sure enough, it was a foreign object, but he wasn't quite sure what it was. And so he kind of, low-key reached into the drawer and pulled out an implement known as a tweezer, but it doesn't cost $1.99. It costs $59.99. And he looked in the man's ear, and he reached in there, and he grabbed this foreign object, and he pulled it out, and he put it in his palm of his hand, and he quickly determined, based upon the writing on this little thing, that it was a suppository. And he was puzzled. So he wheeled around to the front of the man, and he said, "Sir, I just pulled a suppository out of your ear." And the man was kind of thrilled and delighted and had this look of excitement on his face. And he said, "Why are you so excited about that?" And he said, "Well, I've been looking for my hearing aid. I think I know where it's at now." I had a friend tell me that joke and then told me I couldn't tell it. And I was like, you can't tell me a joke. And like, that's a good joke. We've done worse. Supposedly prayer is about talking and listening, but it's kind of not, is it? Like, hence the series, hence the tension, hence the frustration with prayer, hence the mystery and the confusion and the angst, and at times the blessing. Because we've made prayer into something way more than that. I would submit to you that are you still explaining the joke? What's a suppository? Yeah, I know, she's 12. That's good. It's to your credit that you don't understand that. Good job. I'm sorry. I'm pointing you out because now I'm making it all worse. We've made it way more, right? I would submit to you that we've made prayer about like getting things. And it's this thing we've picked up along the road, and maybe it's more burdensome than not, because prayer is about getting things, and some of us arrive at this place in our life with God where we're like, well, prayer's about getting things, and frankly, Lord, you know what I need before I ask, and so I'm just frankly delighted to just take what you got for me. And hence we become really casual and maybe really lazy, or at least really loose in our prayer life. At other times, it just elicits cynicism in us. And it reaffirms our suspicion that a great deal of Christianity is narcissistic and egotistical, because all it is about this big God in heaven who will give us what we need when we ask. And frankly, it seems a little trivial because there's people dying because they don't have food to eat, and we're asking for like a parking spot. And I think the question that we're trying to get after here is like, okay, if prayer is not about getting things, then why ask? Like, why bother? I think another thing that we've made it into is we've made prayer about changing God's mind, about getting God to do something that he's otherwise reluctant to do, about changing the will of God. Now, I know I'm on thin theological ice here because there's a lot of places in the text where that's exactly what prayer did accomplish. You have Abraham in the book of Genesis where he has this conversation with God because God's going to wipe out a couple key cities, but it happens that some of Abraham's loved ones are in that city, and he begins to negotiate with God and effectively negotiates the life of his nephew Lot. Moses has a real similar experience when, upon leaving Egypt with God's people, they find themselves in the desert, and the people prove to be broken, which is kind of what the story is all about. Like, broken as broken can get, but God loves them anyway. And God's a little frustrated with their brokenness, and he says he's going to crush them, and Moses gets in God's way, stands in the gap, some church people say, and changes God's mind. I mean, oftentimes prayer is about changing God's mind, and yet we've tried it. And the track record is confusing. And we have all these spiritual words we use like God's will and he knows best and all things work for the good. And sometimes those are really, really helpful, and sometimes they seem really, really flat and shallow. And we're reluctant now. We're confused. We're frustrated. We're embarrassed, perhaps. Maybe on God's behalf, maybe on our own. I think sometimes it's easier... the easiest way to save your faith is just to stop praying. You know, like, I love God, I trust God, I want to obey him. If I just don't ask him to do things, then life is that much less confusing, and so I'll just roll that way. And it kind of gets at the question of, okay, if prayer's not about changing God's mind, then why ask? Like, why bother? Why do that? So, I got a little riddle for you. What is this? It's kind of a responsive service. What is this? It's a barn. Yeah, it's not rocket science. And now I've got two more pieces of the riddle. What am I doing now? I'm walking in a circle. Maybe this will help. Maybe it won't, because I learned last service. This is a colloquialism that, like, I'm apparently very old, or I'm from Laurel. What am I doing now? Who just said that? You're a genius. Did you cheat? Oh, you cheater. I'm taking the long way around the barn. I had all these, like, 20-somethings back for the service going, like, long way around the barn? Where are you from? Like, when were you born? Dude, I'm 32. You've never heard How many of you have heard a long way around the barn before in your life? I'm in elderly company. Sorry. We're going to get there. But I want us to go in kind of an indirect direction. I'm just warning you. Let's go to Matthew 7. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives. Those who seek find. And to those who knock, the door will be opened. Here's the confusion, right? Like, I'm constantly saying one of the values and the cultures of our staff and of our organization is I'm constantly talking about, like, let's under-promise and over-deliver. So if you can have it there on Friday, then say Friday, and get it there on Wednesday, maybe. But don't say you can have it there on Wednesday and get it to them on Friday, right? Like, this is kind of basic respect for people. Under-promise, over-deliver. And it all too often in our spiritual journeys with God, it seems like Jesus does the exact opposite here. I mean, those are some big promises. Ask and it'll be given to you. Seek and you'll find. Knock and the door will be given, will be opened. Which leads right to, I asked. and he's still going to die. It's still terminal. Like I asked, and I'm still frustrated, I'm still confused, I'm still alone, she's still sick. Or it leads to the abuses, right? The trivialness, the narcissism, the selfishness, like Lamborghinis and parking spots and A's on tests. I would submit like one of the most frustrating, confusing passages in the whole Bible on prayer, and yet it's kind of at the center of it all. It's the one that, like for me personally, I like to skip when I get there because it's just, well, it's tumultuous. Unless it happens in a bigger context and it's part of a bigger conversation. Now, I'm indebted this morning to Rob Bell and Andy Stanley and Ray Vanderland, I suspect, and Scott McKnight for where we're going this morning. We're going to go the long way around the barn. The big idea is this, because I'll likely confuse you because I myself am confused. And I was at the fair on Friday and the air show yesterday, and big idea is this. What if prayer starts with a belief that says, God wants to know my desires, and he wants to know your desires. And that's not narcissistic, and it's not egotistical. It's a reflection of a God who is madly in love with you and madly in love with the world, and he just wants to know your desires. Because in Matthew 6, here's kind of the flow. Matthew 7 that we just read is in Matthew 7. That's why I said Matthew 7. Matthew 6, you have Jesus in, like the greatest teaching that he ever gave, the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 6, you have God inviting people into a non-anxious presence in the world. He's saying to people, if you'll trust me, if you'll walk with me, you can surrender your anxieties, you can surrender your worries, you can exist in what the Apostle Paul called with a peace that surpasses all understanding, right? In Matthew 6:25, Jesus said it this way, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more important than food and the body more important than clothes? This non-anxious presence because of the thing that you've got going on with the King of the universe. And then in Matthew 7, he transitions it because God always takes it from you and him to you and him and how you can serve the world. It always takes it from you beyond you. In Matthew 7, he takes it to the next concentric circle of relationships, of having a non-anxious presence, a non-anxious ethos in your relationships. And he goes into Matthew 7:1, do not judge, or you too will be judged. If, relationally, you have anxiety, isn't one of the first things you start to do to try to control people around you. If you're not surrendered, isn't the only option left control, manipulation? And isn't one of the best negative forms of control and manipulation words of criticism, the withdrawal of praise? We can control, we can manipulate people negatively. Matthew 7:6, do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw pearls to pigs. Now, this text reminds me of the rabbinic statement that the text has 70 faces. Some have said that it's like this precious gem you can hold in the sun and it reflects light differently every time you turn it just a little bit, because pearls and pigs, if you're familiar with the Bible, there's so many different takes and so many different looks. But if you buy that it's happening, that what Jesus is getting at here is non-anxious presence, you in the Lord, because of the trust you have in the Lord, and then it moves into your relationships and you have a non-anxious way of existing in your relationships, then we can control people through our judgment and our criticism and our critique. Can't we also control them with our gifts? Can't we also give people stuff? Now, I'm not suggesting that every gift is manipulative, but we can do this, right? What if Jesus is trying to do some heart surgery here, a work of the heart, and he's inviting us into a way of having relationship where we don't try to control and we don't try to manipulate, we do something entirely different, what I would call entirely more healthy, what Jesus would call that. So here's the question. Here's the long way around the barn. Is Matthew 7 and all of its frustration, is it about us and God, and is it just about prayer, or does it happen in a bigger stream, a bigger conversation where Jesus is unpacking way more than just you and God? He's talking about your relationships in general. Because if we're not going to manipulate and we're not going to control, what do we have left to do? We can ask. We can respect people by asking. See, asking is an entirely different posture than is controlling, isn't it? When we ask, we're respecting what? That they can say yes or they can say no. On Monday, I was a part of a funeral service, and I had a van full of flowers when it was over, and we pulled up to this house where the family was, and I had some friends there, and Lincoln was with them, my oldest, and they were coming up to the van to help me carry them up to the house because I'm antisocial and I park on the road because I don't want to get trapped. That's a different story. And so they were up at the van with me and getting flowers and, that type of stuff from a funeral. And I said to Lincoln before we started walking up there, I said, hey, do you want to be helpful? This is a phrase that my wife and I use a lot with him. And he didn't really say anything, but we kind of made our way back to the van, and I went to hand him something, and he's like, I don't want to carry that. Like, what do you mean you don't want to carry that? Like, who said that's an option? And I, forced my will upon it. Like, you'll carry it or else you'll, sit in the car for the next 3 weeks. And then he said, well, Dad, you asked if I wanted to be helpful. I don't want to be helpful. Right? Asking is an entirely different type of posture. Now, I'm not suggesting that we can never be authoritative with our kids, but it's a good point. Because asking is an entirely different posture, isn't it? Because when we ask, we're respecting that person can say yes, or they can say, no, I really appreciate that you asked me to help you move, and I'd love to help you, but my boundaries are saying I can't this week. Can't do that. Sorry. Can't. We can say yes, we can say no. See, asking is an art form, and yet the implications, and I think when we get inside the implications of asking, prayer can take on a whole different form, because the implications are crazy. Several months ago, my wife was out of town and unreachable, and she's an RN, and I am the opposite thereof. And one of the boys woke me up in the middle of the night and was clearly very sick, like 105-ish sick. So, you assess the situation, and my panic button is large. And so, it doesn't take a RN to figure out, well, probably I should get him to the emergency room. It's 2 or 3 in the morning. Can't remember. But then I go okay, so I got these 2 other little kids, so I'm going to have to call somebody to have them come hang out with the other kids, right? And you start working the list in your head. Now, how many of you are going dude, should have called me, could have called me, you could have called me? How many of you? I have no friends. How many of you are dude, you could have called me? Yeah, because when you hear that a friend had a need, right, you instinctively go you should have called me. You should have called me. In fact, so much so, right, that when you find out that a friend had a need, emergency or otherwise, and you find out they didn't ask you, what does that feel like? Now you start going where are we? Wow, what does that say about where we're at? They didn't even ask me. Why? Because asking connects us. It's not about manipulation, it's not about control, but asking affirms the relationship. By the way, that whole story is a lie. Any example I came up from my real life felt manipulative, so I decided I'd make one up. Because I don't want to be that guy who's I'm a pastor, I got all these problems, would you help me? Because you all aren't busy too. Jesus invited us into a completely different type of relationship, a completely different way of relating to others. But see, our problem is we are bent towards individualism. We are bent towards independence. It's the air we breathe, the water that we swim in. If you were to put on a trajectory, what does it look like to be a healthy American? Independent is right on there, so we don't want to ask. Here's a linguistic example to prove that. I'm going to say a sentence, but put a blank in there. You tell me what goes in there. Larry blank lives at home. What word should go in there? Larry blank lives at home. Still. Joe, where's Johnson? Last service, sound guy yelled out Johnson. It's Larry Johnson's. Sorry, I threw you under the bus. I'm throwing you under the bus a lot this morning. Okay, next sentence. Larry is a blank. What goes there? Loser. Yeah. Never mind that Larry's 11, right? Actually, no, Larry's 49 and collects model trains. Seriously, though, right? It's just instinctive. Think of the language that we do use when we do ask. We say things like, I'm so sorry to ask. It grieves me that I have to ask. We say, I hate to ask. Hate? Really? Aren't we the ones that are saying to our kids all the time, hate's a strong word. I hate to ask. In our very language, we show that we don't like to ask. Manipulate, easier. Tell, easier. Ask, uncomfortable. And then we go start looking for because some of you are already here, I know it, but what about, where's the crazy relative clause, right? Like, where's that at? Because I've written numerous checks, and I got less and they got less. I mean, like, this all goes to Lotto, which I guess means it goes to the schools, but, right, like, just kidding. Right? Like, or like Lincoln asked me the other day when we went by Vans, like, Dad, what about the guy with the sign? What about the guy with the sign, right? Like, what about the exception clause? Because Jesus, isn't it interesting? He doesn't get into the exception. He doesn't start saying, like, except for your crazy aunt, right? He doesn't do that. How many of your parents? How many of you, your parents, or that your kids ask you for things? What do they ask for? Give me some things. What do your kids ask you for? Money, stuff, snacks, rides, babysit, more money. What else? More money. There's a theme. Clothes. Let me ask you this. Would it be better if they just didn't ask? Would you prefer it that way? Of course you wouldn't. You would say that a healthy relationship with your kids involves their asking and you're reserving the right to go like, no, not going to do that this time. Right? Like, we choose our no's wisely, pick our no's wisely. We try to say yes as much as we can. But we would just assume, what if God, what if that's his posture? What if Jesus doesn't get into the exceptions and the exclusions, and he doesn't get into all the asterisks because he wants you to understand the gift that is asking? Like, what if God's the guy that goes like, well, just ask? It's not like it's a guarantee any more than it is between you and your parents, but ask. Because where he goes from here, Jesus, is a couple parables. In Matthew 7:9, he continues on in this trajectory after the ask, seek, knock. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone, or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask you? Just ask. Like, what if God is unpacking a posture of just like, hey, just ask. Like, don't feel like you have to manipulate. You don't have to get into these long, ornate ceremonies. You don't have to do any of that. Just ask. And then it's just like, wait a minute. I thought you just told us this whole deal was about relationships. That was just about between you and God, me and God. But then the next verse, so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. Now wait a minute. So is this ask thing, is this about me and God, or is this about me and others? Because he just said the same thing. Which gets into the Eastern mind, Western mind thing, right? Because the Western mind wants it to be one thing, and the Eastern mind never wants it to be one thing. They embrace the complexity of it. Jesus was constantly blurring those lines. He's the one that when asked, like, what really matters? He said, love God, love people. And they went like, we asked for one. And he went, yeah, love God, love people. And he's like, that's two. Like, did you skip first grade? And Jesus' response was like, I can't boil it down any further than that. He's constantly blurring the lines. He even said at one point, if you don't forgive others their sins, your heavenly Father won't forgive yours. What's he doing? He's blurring the line between the relationships you have with people and the relationships you have with him. That the way you reflect, the way you have relationship with people reflects the way you have relationship with him, and the way you have relationship with him reflects the way you have relationship with people. What if when we kind of we've tried to zap our thinking on prayer a little bit. What if it starts with a God who says, like, just tell me your desires. You don't have to manipulate me. You don't have to try to control me. Please don't. Just ask, just seek, just knock. Remember that series we did in February and March? The Robotic Love series? We will go down in infamy for the logo, the two robots, because all the single people, they couldn't handle the robots being that close together, and so I took a lot of heat. I didn't ever notice the hands until the single people pointed out the hands. This is my theory. One of my favorite stories from the series was there was a gal who's consistently at the 9 now. She started bringing a friend with her. And remember at the end of the series, we gave out those magnets, and it had desire or expectation on it, because that was the whole theme of the whole series is like, if desires, there's relationship. With expectations, you have business contracts. And so this magnet had all of that, and then it had desire, expectation, then it had the website on it. So this friend of this gal, she took the magnet home and she put it on her refrigerator. And this gal had been newly married, and her daughter came over, not knowing that it was a church magnet, but seeing the image and hearing the phrase robotic love and seeing there was a web address on there, went up to her mom and said, Mom, not sure what you and your new husband are into, but you shouldn't put it on the refrigerator. That series, and I say this dramatically on purpose, it changed the way I understand prayer. Because what we really dialed in that series was in 1 Peter 5. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him. Some translations reads, cast all your cares on him, because he cares for you. For what shifted there for me, like before that, I thought of prayer that it was supposed to be this type A CEO type mentality where your job is to wear God out. Right? Because that's all the celebrated prayers. The people who like tell, and God, I'm not going away until you give me my way, and I got my list, and I'll pray over these lists for 30 years. God, you got to do it, I'm believing. Now, is there a place for that? Yeah, there is. What shifted for me is a mentality where God needs me to tell him what to do, to a God who says, like, cast all your anxieties on me. Why? Because I care for you. My prayer time now in the morning, I used to dread it, kind of, because I just don't like, God, I need you to do this, I need you to do this, I need you to do this. I just sit over the table, and when I get to the office, spend the first chunk of time sitting in my chair, and I just go like, God, here's my desires. I'm not claiming they're perfect, I'm not claiming they're holy, I'm not even claiming they reflect your will. Like, here's what I'm desiring for myself, for Narrate, for my family, for friends. I mean, I'm not suggesting they're all selfish. Some of them could be. God, here's my desires. Paul seems to have understood it in a very similar fashion. In Philippians 4, he said, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Just talk to him about your desires. What if prayer, it's not about getting things, it's not about changing God's mind. What if it starts, and there's a part 2, and we're going to get into that next week that I think has to be married to this one for it to make sense. But what if at the foundation of what the Bible teaches us about prayer is there's a God who is a parent who wants to know your desires. See, I think that the struggle is if this water could represent like purity, that when we think about prayer and when we do pray, what we do is we bring to God this, like unadulterated stuff. And we weed out the desires that are unhealthy. We weed out the desires that are sinful. We weed out conversation with God about some of the stuff that we're not proud of and we're not ashamed of and we're not sure if we should desire this. And so we find ourselves not having very much to pray for. Because we feel like what God is asking us to do is bring like the perfect, pure offering of prayer. What if? What if that's kind of a misunderstanding? What if the God who wants to know our desires is okay with there being good stuff in there? And some gross stuff? Somewhere around here there's a McDonald's cheeseburger that I can't find. I need to find that. Maybe not. How does this work? There's as I cram all these random things into a blender, you might want to look under your chair. If you find the star, then you get to drink it. It wasn't a joke. We're a shaming church. We'll shame you until you drink it. I'm just kidding. Anybody's gag reflex going off? It's too bad that cheeseburger's not in there. Can't do it. I mean, I can't even drink that, let alone this. What if the permission of God, the ask, the seek, the knock, to cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you? What if the invitation, what if a healthy prayer life begins by you not filtering your desires? Knowing that there's some good stuff in there and there's some bad stuff, there's some gross stuff and there's some confusing stuff. What if God's okay with you sitting with him in the quietness and the solitude of a walk or your living room or however it is you best connect with God and expressing desires to him that you know are sinful? and saying, God, like, I don't get it, but here's a desire that I have. And others of them that just seem too big. Maybe you're confused whether or not they're selfish. What if God is a God who says, hey, just talk to me about your desires? Is there other things? Yeah, we'll go there. We'll talk about that. You know, Paul, he alludes to the fact that when we cast our anxiety on him, when we talk to him about our desires, we have a peace. And I think people who understand the discipline of just like, tell God your desires, they understand that sometimes the desire goes away simply by telling God it's a desire. And sometimes God is the God who cares for you and the desire gets met. The peace that surpasses all understanding, it's a result of going like, God, here's my desire. I don't understand it. I don't get it. Here it is. It's been astounding for me in my own walk with God to just go like, I'm not going to tell you what to do. One example, when I stumbled upon this, it was late February, and I wouldn't be being dramatic if I said that myself and the council was kind of looking at the trajectory of Narrate, and particularly the financial trajectory, and we were kind of looking at it sideways going, it's 50-50 whether or not this is going to work, whether or not this church plant's going to stick. And I just started saying to God, like, God, up until then, it was just like chutzpah, like, God, do this, because, here's what we need you to do. And my posture changed, and I just started saying to God every day, like, Lord, our desire is to plant a church that's, like, service-orientated, that the community would be bummed if we cease to exist, that we remind ourselves that we serve a rabbi who broke his body and poured out his blood for others. It'd be really great to be that kind of church in our community for a long time. That's the desire. But I leave it with you. And what's insane, and those of you that have been with us since about February know what's insane is the financial trajectory since. I mean, there was a season where we were going, we may or may not have money in September. And now we're in a season where we're going, we may or may not break even this year. I think God is a God who wants to know our desires, and sometimes out of sheer affection for you, he wants to meet them, and other times he'll free you from them. My question for you is this. What desires do you have? The junk, the good stuff. And what would happen in your heart and in your life and in your world if you just started going like, God, here's my desires. Here they are. Let's just pray and give you a chance to begin talking to God about that. Would you just bow your heads and close your eyes and just take 20 seconds to begin that process with the Lord, and I'll close this up. Lord, prayer is of central importance. It's historic. It's sacred. We're entering into this conversation not out of disrespect, but out of kind of a desire to detoxify our understandings and try to boil it down. And I see a lot of irony, God, that we would begin a conversation about prayer by saying, well, maybe it starts by just telling God your desires. And it sure seems that that's the types of relationships that Jesus invited us into, where we don't manipulate and we don't control, where we just ask and we trust you. And Paul and Peter, these guys who lived crazy lives, post your death and resurrection and ascension, they seem to come to understand that you're a God who just wants to hear our desires. God, there's a ton of stuff represented in this room, from trivial stuff to like health, being alive a month from now. So God, we just want to expand the conduit through which we talk to you. And I pray that you would help us to understand that you're okay hearing our desires. And you don't need us to filter them for you, and that you would love the opportunity to filter them with us. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.